Good morning and welcome to the New America Foundation. I'm David Gray and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion on economic security at risk, introducing the first measure of economic insecurity for American families. For much of this past decade, policymakers have increasingly been studying what many American families know all too well, that economic insecurity is on the rise in our nation. Increases in the cost of health care, education, housing, and other goods over the past generation, combined with stagnant wages, particularly for those with medium or little income, little education, has led to an increase in inequality and troubling insecurity for many families in our country. In order to try and develop solutions to address these concerns, New America is grateful to have been able to partner with the Rockefeller Foundation these past several years as we consider the next social contract for our country, and we appreciate their support both of those efforts in this event today. So this morning, we have an opportunity to hear about and discuss a new development that will help those interested in the future of American families better understand and address the insecurity those families face. Today's event is a bit of a homecoming for our friend and former New America Fellow, Jacob Hacker. Jacob Hacker is a distinguished professor at Yale University, and he and his research team have developed a groundbreaking new index that provides the first integrated measure of the economic insecurity of American families. This morning, Jacob will discuss this index and the opportunities that it presents. Following his presentation, we'll hear from a distinguished panel of respondents and have the opportunity for your questions. We're pleased that E.J. Dion is here to moderate. You should wait for the microphone when we get to the Q&A, for the microphone to come to you, and when you're asking a question, please state your name and affiliation and then ask a brief question of our speakers. And a couple of reminders to please silence your cell phones, and this is on the record and is being webcast. So thank you all for being with us today, and it's now my pleasure to introduce Janice Natali, who is the Associate Vice President and Managing Director of the Rockefeller Foundation. Janice?
Thank you, David. Thanks again, David, and thanks for giving us a home. We at Rockefeller like to consider New America Foundation part of the extended family and part of our home, and glad you let us take it literally today. I'd like to put the Economic Security Index in context for us at Rockefeller as we begin this morning. The Foundation Campaign for American Workers is a 5-year, $70 million commitment to improve the economic security of working Americans through better public policies and programs aimed at helping people save for today, for their retirement, and to have the benefit of health insurance. We focus on those struggling the most, and we try to make it easier for people trying to make it. This focus for Rockefeller is no new passing fancy. Rockefeller provided funding and staff to the 1934 committee that designed Social Security, and as early as 1923 supported the work that led to the first American proposals of Social Security as a concept in 1926. And although we may have lost sight of this, for the first 40 years of life of Social Security, it was intended to be a framework for Americans' economic security. Now, Jacob probably feels like he's been working with Rockefeller on this index project since 1923, but it really is only since 2006. Back then, and before we started to work together with Jacob and his team, we assumed that at Rockefeller that we could just find and use an existing index of economic security. And we found a lot of indexes, something like 55 of them, but none of them really captured what the team will present here to you today. Let me give you a couple of examples, if I may, to suggest what I mean by that. The unemployment rate, for example, is the best-known measure of joblessness, but it doesn't speak to the state of people's savings. Similarly, the percent of families below the poverty line is a well-known indicator of need, but it doesn't deal with the affordability of health care for families. We wanted a measure that was simple to understand, that tied together all the economic questions you think about when you think about your family and your future when you're at your kitchen table. So you're going to hear from the experts on these questions, and so there's no point in my trying to do better than that. But one thing funders are supposed to do is to see around the corners and over the nearer hillsides to glimpse what's just over the horizon. So let me suggest that our hope is that this index will help us do that for many years in the future, to measure us against our aspirations and to tell us maybe not what we want to hear, but what we should know about ourselves as a country. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you two people. First is the prime mover of our work and our leader for today. First, to the work. In addition to being the Stanley Resor Professor of Political Science at Yale, Jacob is the author of The Great Risk Shift, an expert on economic security, and the leader of the team that developed the Economic Security Index. And I'm very lucky I can call him a colleague. I'm delighted to say that you'll be hearing much more from Jacob in a moment. Secondly, our moderator for today. As David mentioned, I'm proud to say he's one of the most respected voices in journalism and policy, E.J. Dionne. E.J.'s earned that respect because his insights and analysis of public policy and the workings of Washington are always grounded at the kitchen table, where it affects American families. We know E.J. from his column in the Washington Post, which is now syndicated and appearing over 100 newspapers, his comments on politics on NPR, ABC's This Week, and NBC's Meet the Press, and his books, which include the award-winning Why Americans Hate Politics, which oddly was written in the early 1990s. E.J., thanks very much for agreeing to moderate our time together. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Hacker.
Well, thanks so much, Janice, and thank you all for being here. There's a lot of thanks I want to offer, and I'm going to do so very quickly because I have a limited period of time, but I would be remiss if I didn't start by noting that I was an inaugural fellow here at the New America Foundation. So I was here when it was just a gleam in the eye of its founders, and I'm really proud to be able to come back here and see so much having happened over the last 15 years or so since its start. I want to thank in particular those who made this event possible, including Stephanie Gunter, Reed Kramer, Troy Schneider, and Mike Lind, who, alas, wasn't able to be here today, and, of course, Steve Cole, the president of the foundation. Janice kept her introduction short, so I'll keep my thanks to her short, but I'm honored as well to be her colleague, and I'm very grateful to the Rockefeller Foundation for supporting me and my team. It's rare to have the kind of support that we had for an independent intellectual project. And this independence, I think, was really reinforced by a technical advisory group assembled by the foundation, 3 of whose members will be speaking today. That group in its entirety was Henry Aaron, Gary Burtless, Henry Farber, Bob Greenstein, Alicia Manel, and Bob Solo. And Bob Solo, I really wanted to be here, but apparently this is not quite enticing enough to get him off of Martha's Vineyard in late July. I want to thank EJ, too. At the same time as I was about to become an inaugural fellow, I was sharing an office across from him at the Brookings Institution. Well, I say an office, but it was more like an alcove. And let's just say I did a lot less work on my dissertation and a lot more drinking of red wine than I would have had I been located in a different spot. And then finally, I just want to say up front, I'm going to say more in a moment, that my team is really an integral part of this project. They're a remarkable bunch, and I want to thank them right up front for making this work possible. So that's a lot of thanks, and I want to keep my remarks to about 15 minutes to let our web guru, Jeff Rabkin, show you the great site that he and his team at Wowza developed. And whenever I'm asked to speak for a limited period of time, it reminds me of one of the first evaluations I received as a new assistant professor at Yale. It began quite promisingly. It said, "Professor Hacker, if I had just 15 minutes to live, I'd want to spend it in your class. Because that way it would seem like an hour." So I very much hope that the next 15 minutes seems close to the actual time. Now, as all of you know, there's a huge amount of concern about economic security today among Americans, among their leaders, and increasingly among researchers studying economic policy. But this was true even before the current economic crisis. The Rockefeller Foundation, when it launched its 5-year effort, did an independent poll of Americans' views of their economic security, and what they found is what survey after survey over the last decade or so has shown, is that Americans think their economic security has declined. Now, that is not so surprising in the current context, but remember that these surveys were done, many of these surveys were done in the mid-2000s, when on paper the economy was performing quite well. And I think that raises 2 fundamental questions, and I want to try to separate these issues out in what follows. First, why why is there such concern about economic security today? What are the underlying objective causes of that concern? And second of all, to what extent was that concern elevated even before the recent economic downturn? I've been talking with a lot of reporters. A few years ago when I was telling them there was a decline in economic security, I often had a hard time getting them to pay much attention. Now it's sort of the dog bites man story. So I want to tell you about the man bites dog side of it, or at least the man nips dog side of it, which is the long-term upward trend in economic insecurity that we found. First, of course, it's probably necessary to say a little bit about what we mean by economic security. And despite the fact that this has been a part of public discourse for decades, as Janice noted, way back to the Committee on Economic Security, it's notable that there isn't actually a kind of accepted definition among researchers who study the economy. But we all know, I think, intuitively what it means. It has something to do with protection against large-scale economic loss. And it sort of has two components as a result. On the one hand, we face risks to our economic well-being, and on the other hand, we have protections against those risks. And it's really the degree to which we are adequately protected that determines our economic security. Now, of course, economic security is something that we feel. We feel insecure or not. We feel anxious. We feel worried. But we know very well from the surveys that people are feeling insecure. What we really wanted to assess with this project was, is there ample reason for this concern? Or to put it more precisely, are the objective economic circumstances of families consistent with this notion of economic security or insecurity? And so we were looking for something that, as Janice noted, that was like the poverty or the unemployment rate, but that was broader. And in particular, we wanted a measure that really captured the dynamic economic circumstances of family, how they change over time. So this is an introduction to what we define as the Economic Security Index. I'm going to give you the formal definition right now, but then I'll try to just unpack it very quickly to give you a sense of what, why we defined it as we did. So the ESI it really has three basic elements to it. On the one hand, we're just looking at essentially the short-term income losses. And the only tricky feature of this is that we look really at people's available resources after they spend on medical care. So we call this available income. And researchers and poverty experts have long argued that we really should subtract out non-discretionary medical costs, out-of-pocket medical costs from income, because it's obviously a constraint on your ability to spend on other means. And so what this means is that if someone faces an income drop of 25% or greater, they're counted as insecure. But it's also the case that if they face an increase in their medical costs that's 25% or greater, they would be insecure. And obviously the combination of those two could be, say, 10% increase in medical cost as a share of income and a 15% decline in income. Then the only other really notable feature of this definition of income is that we try to make sure that we're accounting for all sources of income. We're accounting for government and private benefits. We're adjusting income. We're looking at individuals, but we're looking at their household income. We adjust income to reflect the economies of scale of pooling resources within the family. When you're over 60, we say you receive an annuity equal to your 401k plan, retirement accounts, and so on. We subtract out the service of the debts that you have. And then finally, we know that some people will have enough savings, a safety net, if you will, to be able to deal with these income losses. So we also ask, how long does it take for someone to recover when they experience an income loss of the size that they experience? And based on that length of recovery, we calculate how much savings they would need, and we look to see if they have that savings. And if they do, then they're not counted as insecure. So basically, it's an on-off, and it's a share. This index is just a share of the population that gets counted as insecure. And in the report, if you've had a chance to look at it, there's a little figure for Andrea and John that shows you that it could be it's the combination of these income and medical cost changes that really matters. Now, we chose these three elements on two bases. First of all, kind of a theoretical basis. Income is, of course, the most important determinant of family well-being. It's the main source of resources for people, is their earnings, but also other sources of income they receive. In addition, we know that the largest non-discretionary component of income on average is medical costs, and it's one that's widely accepted as a constraint on income. And we know from much research that some people don't have adequate savings and other people do, and we really want to distinguish between those people. In particular, we want to make sure that people who are really well off, who experience large income declines, aren't counted as insecure if they have a lot of savings. But we also had another reason for these three. It turns out when we did a survey fielded by the American National Election Studies that actually asked people what kinds of economic risks they most feared and felt were most within their control or most beyond their control. And these were the ones that really rose to the top. So it's both that we thought there were theoretical reasons for it and public opinion supported the inclusion of these three. Now, what's tricky about looking at the dynamic economic circumstances of people is we have to look at the change in their economic circumstances. We need panel data, and it turns out there are really only two candidates for such research: the Survey of Income and Program Participation of the Census Bureau and the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, the PSID, the SIP and the PSID. Now, we did not decide until fairly late in this project which we would use, and we actually, as you'll see, kind of took the easy route of choosing to use them both in different ways. But we decided ultimately on the Survey of Income Program Participation. It has much larger samples so that we're able to look at a much finer grained picture of who's insecure and who's not, a much more reliable picture. Its wealth data, which we need for the safety net calculations, are more frequent, and its medical spending data is a lot better. In fact, really can't use the Panel Study of Income Dynamics for this kind of analysis. But the PSID does have a couple virtues that would allow us to draw on it. For one thing, it goes back to the late 1960s, unlike the SIP, which starts in 1984. So we're actually going to show you, if we were doing a more limited version of our calculations for the previous period, what things looked like prior to when we do our official authoritative index based on the SIP. In addition, it follows people for a long time. So we can look at how long it takes people to recover, whereas the SIP is these mini panels that only last 2 to 4 years, so we can't follow people for very long. So those are the reasons that we chose these two data sets. Now, these are bears of data sets to use, and fortunately, I was not the only one having to go into the data. Instead, I had a star-studded cast. I told you I'd introduce them, of super crunchers. You're going to have to forgive me. This is what passes for humor among us data folks. We have Gregory Huber, Moop Man, medical out-of-pocket expenditures. We have Philip Ream, who I call the detonator. We have Mark Schlesinger, who, I'm sorry, I'm running out of names, public opinionator. And finally, my favorite, Rob Valletta, Sipperman. Now, Rob, Philip, Mark, and Greg each took on a conundrum that we faced. And so it's useful to introduce them as the cast of superheroes because once you see the formidable barriers that they had to overcome, you'll be more impressed. So what are some of those problems? And really quickly, how did we resolve them? And so the first is that although the SIP is much better medical spending than any other source we could use, it doesn't go back far enough with that medical data. In fact, we had to use another data source, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, to basically predict medical spending for families. Fortunately, we had Moop Man, medical out-of-pocket expenditures, or Moop. Greg, who produced the most sophisticated imputation prediction procedure ever devised. You can read all about it in the technical report. But just to give you a sense of how good it is, this is the observed and versus the predicted levels, and we're very, very accurate in predicting for the years that we have both the actual data and our prediction model for predicting the actual levels. So we're very confident that we're capturing not just the level of spending of people, medical out-of-pocket expenditures, but the change from year to year, which influences, of course, our index. What was our next problem? Well, we don't have wealth data for every year. We have wealth data for essentially all the people that we're looking at, but sometimes we only have 1 year of observation of wealth, sometimes we have 2. So basically we decided, and this was a painful decision in many ways, but it was made thanks to our detonator, we decided basically to look at levels of wealth that families had rather than at changes of wealth over time. So we're really not capturing one aspect of current economic insecurity, namely the big wealth losses that people have. So in that sense, the current levels of insecurity that we find are understating the degree of insecurity. And one thing that you find that may not be so surprising, and this is a figure from the report, is that wealth levels, especially for those who are most indebted, have fallen. At the median, basically, the median family has no financial safety net. We're only looking at liquid financial wealth. We're not looking at housing wealth. And the main reason is we don't think that the house is it should be seen as a source of economic security when people experience large income declines, but we can talk more about that later. But you can see that for people who are at the bottom of wealth holdings, say the 10th or the 25th percentile, they've gotten much more indebted. And that does contribute to the rise. But the main story is that not a lot of people have the kind of financial safety net necessary to deal with these losses. Another problem I just mentioned is that we need to be able to look at how long it takes people to get back, but we can only look at 2 to 4 years. So therefore, we use the panel study of income dynamics to look at how long it takes to get back to your prior income. And this is itself, I think, quite arresting. So when we started this, and by the way, the detonator was the man, when we started this, I think the assumption was that 25% or greater losses were rectified in just a handful of years. And I guess if you define a handful as 6 to 8 years, you would be correct. But this is the actual trajectories of recovery for people who experience losses of each of these sizes. And as you can see, for 50% or 35 to 50% drops, it takes 8 years to get back. So basically, we asked how much savings would you need to cover that loss for 6 years. We truncated it 6 years to make the calculations more tractable, which also makes our index a little bit more likely to understate insecurity again. And then finally, this is the big problem. The SIP does not go past 2007 currently. We will next year have the most recent wave of the SIP, but for the moment we're constrained by this available data. So we called in a team, our SIPper man, as well as our public opinionator, together to solve this problem. And what they did was this. Our SIPper man constructed a projection model that predicted forward, and so we got numbers based on the historical relationship between the ESI and aggregate economic statistics, like the change in the unemployment rate. Meanwhile, our public opinionator designed a public opinion survey where we actually asked people, had they experienced losses of this size in their income. And together, we can use this to basically come up with a projection that we verify using this survey. And it's a projection and not we distinguish it from the 1985 to 2007 index that uses the SIP data because we don't have the same exact data source for that period. In addition, because of limits of what you can ask people in a regular opinion survey, we're only looking at income loss here. We're not looking at people's medical costs. We're not looking at their wealth holdings. So what is a big lead up? What does the index show? Okay, not surprisingly, given what I've said before, it shows a big increase in the share of Americans who are experiencing the kind of losses that are captured by the SIP. And I think the ups and downs are very interesting in the sense that they show that this is clearly driven by the business cycle. So it's not at all surprising that we find a very large increase in the most recent downturn as well as peaks in each of the previous recessions since 1985. But it's also the case that we can calculate the statistical trend over time, which we superimpose here for the 1985 to 2007 period, which really is calculating out this up and down movement of the business cycle. And if you do that, we have about a one-third increase in economic insecurity over the 1985 to 2007 period. If you include the projections, it's about a 50% increase. So to the present, from 85, we've seen an increase of about half in the level of economic insecurity. I mentioned that we could use the PSID to go back prior to 1985, and there's two tricky aspects of that I'll just flag. One is that we can only look at 2-year losses in the PSID. I didn't mention this in my problems. The PSID has, since 1996, only asked people about their income every other year. So we're basically looking here at a number that's different than the one we're looking at on the right. We're saying from 1 year to 2 years later, what percentage of people experienced a 25% or greater income loss. As I mentioned, the other thing is the PSAD doesn't allow us to look at medical costs and wealth. But if you look at this figure, what you can really see, if you look across, and it's sort of gotten truncated, you can see the full figure with the 2009 numbers, is that even prior to 1985, the PSAD had shown about a 30% increase in the chance of large income losses. So the fact that we've seen this consistent overtime trend is suggestive of, yet this up and down of the business cycle is suggestive of two simple points. One is that this is highly tied to unemployment in the business cycle, as you would expect when you're talking about large losses, which is why the current period is so fraught with insecurity. But at the same time, there's also a consistent overtime upward trend at any given unemployment rate or poverty rate, as the figure here shows, the economic security index has been larger. So just to give you a sense of that, just looking across the three recession periods, and keep in mind, the three recession periods, and keep in mind that 2009 is a projection, you have a 7.5% unemployment rate in 1992, and a much lower unemployment rate in 2002, yet a higher level of economic insecurity. And not surprisingly, you have a much higher level of unemployment and a much, much higher level of economic insecurity in 2009. And so a way to think about this is that basically there's been a kind of ratcheting up of economic insecurity, that there's the waves, if you will, of the economy that have occurred, as they always have, though very severely in this case. Big waves have crashed down. But also there's the tide of the economy over time, and that tide has pulled out economic security gradually from Americans. And the last thing I'll say about this is one concern we had was, well, maybe what's happening is that people are just clearing the threshold. And what we did check was to see, okay, if you experience a loss of 25% or greater, what is the median, the typical loss? And as you can see, it varies over time, but it's generally gone upwards. And in the latter period, 1985, 95 versus 97, 2007, it's a little bit higher. So I wouldn't make much of the rise, but the point is that if anything, if you take into account the full spectrum of losses, the average would be a little bit higher because these losses have gotten a little bit larger over time. The demographics are all in the report, and I want to conclude, but let me just say one thing. There are 2 points to keep in mind. There are big differences across the income spectrum between blacks and whites, and between people who have high levels of education and people who have low levels of education in their baseline level of security, but at the same time across virtually all demographic groups. One exception is Hispanics, whose composition has changed a lot over this period. We've seen an increase from 1985 to 95 on the one hand, from 2007. So keep those two thoughts in mind. Insecurity has increased, is higher for the people you might expect it to be higher for, but it's increased across the board. And you can really get a picture of that if you look at the share of each income quintile that's defined as insecure. Note that for the lowest income quintile, those in the most recent period, which is, remember, 10 years, not during the current downturn, right, up to 2007, those folks were experiencing the same level of insecurity that's our average level in 2009. But note also, and that's about twice as high as for the highest income quintile, but note also that each of these income quintiles has actually experienced a relatively similar increase over time. What's driving this up is primarily rising income loss. The chance of income loss has increased, but it's also true that at the margin, this is driven up by increasing debt levels, which I noted earlier when you saw that slide, that people who are indebted are more indebted than in the past, and by rising medical costs. And I have to say, this is just independently interesting. With these predictions of medical costs that were done by Greg, our Moot man, you can see here that there's actually a lot of variance across the population in the share of people who are spending more than 10% of their income on medical costs. So not surprisingly, older people are much more likely, and poorer people, which are up at the top here, are much more likely to spend a large share of their income on medical costs. You can see a third of the lowest quartile spends more than 10% on medical costs. Among the aged, it's almost 70%. But note the trends here. For the lowest income non-elderly Americans, that number has been pretty flat. And I see that as a real success of public policy, though we're not sure what's going on. But one aspect of it is probably the expansion of Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program. Another aspect, sadly, and a real limit of our measure of medical out-of-pocket expenditures is that people could be just putting off care and not spending money, or they could be seeking care through less costly settings. For example, transitioning from emergency rooms to clinics. If that's the case, that would lower your spending without necessarily indicating that you're getting more or better, that you're getting less care. So we don't know exactly why this is, but what's really striking is it's really the middle class that's gotten clobbered with rising medical costs. The rich still spend a fairly low share of their income, but middle-class Americans have seen almost a doubling of the share who spend more than non-elderly middle-class Americans that spend more than 10% of income on medical costs. This is one, we're going to investigate what's going on here in a future report, and that's just one of the future reports we'll have. In fact, we are planning to put out a series of reports. One is, if you are excited as I am by this presentation, you can look forward to many more scintillating results. We're first going to come out with our results from our surveys, which I think are very arresting. So the public opinionator will strike again. And then we're going to look forward, and we're really going to unpack the different aspects of the index. And one of the things we're going to do, besides updating the index as new data become available, as I said, next year we should have results for 2009-2010. Sadly, though, for 2009-2010, which means between 2009 and 2010, not for 2008-2009 because of the way the data are set up. But we will also look across advanced industrial democracies to see how distinctive the United States is. I should say that all of this will be available on our website for the index, which I would like to have the designer, or one of the designers, Jeff Rabkin, say a few words about now. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Jacob. Find the mouse here. It must be the one with the little picture of the mouse. When the team came to us to design a website, and in order to provide a place for this data to live, and one of the great things about the internet is it allows us to have data and make it interactive for a general audience, as well as have a website as a place for the more technical information, the more technical detail to live. So as they came to us, as you could see from Jacob's presentation, that some of this information to be accessible to a general audience needs a little bit of help. It's not the simplest, easiest thing to understand. So our job was to really create something that would allow a general audience to really sort of get their head around what's being measured. And our other goal was to really provide some kind of a toy, we call it a toy, but a tool that would be fun to play with. So somebody could start to interact with the data in a way that would be meaningful to them. And really, kind of looking at how do we put a face on this information? How do we make it real? People can understand what it means when they lose their income, but to really understand how the data works across the spectrum. So here's the home page, and you can see that there's a representative of the graph of all Americans with the trend line. So instantly you can kind of get a sense of, really the idea of this worsening trend of what's going on. And then on the other side, you can see we put some faces to the data. What you can imagine is that the difficulty of understanding that this is a sort of a trend over time, but it's not a trend of one individual's insecurity over time. It's really a trend of a demographic group's insecurity over time. So it's really important that we try to communicate that. Let's see, where's the... Anybody know how to work this thing? Is there? Oh. As you see on the right side, there's Amy and Alicia, Sylvia and Suzanne, Donald and Darren, and James and Jamel. They're really people who represent a I had it. Oh, there it is.
It's very sensitive.
Yeah, I see that.
Someone in the control room could just click on Amy and Alicia or any of them you would like.
Yeah, that would be good. If somebody can click on Amy and Alicia.
There you go. Close.
Yes.
Click.
Now somebody knows what they're doing is controlling it. I think that'll work better. You can see that in order to really explain this, we've kind of taken a time machine. We talked about creating a time machine to go back in time. So we found Amy in 1985, and she and Alicia in 2007 share the same demographic characteristics. African American females, age 32, and then you can see in the center that's the graph of that demographic group's financial risk over time. And if somebody could click on Sylvia and Suzanne.
There you go.
This is a good test of usability, I think, as well. Sylvia and Suzanne, again, is showing a different demographic group, and they are, and you can see sort of how that changes from them. And then if we click on Donald and Darren, we get a sense that there are different Donald and Darren. Donald and sporting a very 1985 look, and Darren looking really cool in 2007. So you can see that Darren's insecurity is a little more than Donald. So once we kind of get the website provides this sort of training as to what this data means, then we can explore the index. If you want to click on Explore the Index, two ways to get to that. Then here's the toy that we can play with. So the default is the All Americans line. So right away we can see that there's an All Americans line. And then I hope that all of you are going to run back to your offices and spend the rest of the day playing with this database, because then it's really going to be exciting for everybody, because you can create your own custom indexes. So if you click on education, on the drop down for education, you can see that there's a menu of different characteristics. So you can choose one of those characteristics, maybe choose some college. We want to, and then you can choose, say, an age. We'll choose as you kind of go through and select things on the menu, you can see that the different graph lines appear on the screen. Then you can create a second custom index by clicking on the green square, and then selecting some characteristics from the drop-down menu, and that provides yet another graph on the line. We also have various other functionality in the site. So on the top, you can see that you can choose the drop size. You can include out-of-pocket medical expenses. So there's different layers. What we wanted to provide in this tool was different layers of interaction, so that a more casual user could look at the site and interact with the data on a more general level. A more sophisticated user could go deeper into digging through the data. And I want to say it's not representative of all the data and all the complexities of the data, but really just a sampling to really get a sense of and a feeling for the general trends and the general information. And then on the site, there's also an opportunity to download PDFs of a more complete, comprehensive report, download another report that's actually a copy of the report that you have today, And then in the future, we see the site as really being kind of a living place for this issue to evolve. And as the report evolves and as the data evolves, really this site will grow as kind of the central place for conversation and information to present that. All of these graphs are also available on a printer-friendly basis, so that if you're putting together presentations and reports related to this data, you can go onto the site, customize that report, and generate charts and graphs for your presentation. So I hope you all have a chance to kind of interact with that, and please let us all know if you have suggestions for future improvements. Thanks.
DJ, take it away.
Where is Bob Greenside?
He was, I saw him a second ago, he's in the back.
Come one, come all, respond.
I think I have to. It's good exercise. Well, thank you for all of that. I'm going to go back and click around. Did you notice how sort of cute and beautiful all those pictures were? We may be more economically secure, but we look better than we ever did in our lives. And when Jacob was talking about his super wonks, it made me think of my recollection is all the superheroes of DC Comics were organized as the Justice League of America. And I think we can think of Jacob and his colleagues as the new version of the Justice League of America. Baseball fans all know from Field of Dreams that if you build it, they will come. And I think the policy corollary of that is if you don't measure it, they won't pay attention. And I think that's why what Jacob has done here is so important. We talk about unemployment. We talk about underemployment. We really have not paid enough attention to the economic insecurity of those who, to use the old phrase, work hard and play by the rules. And now, thanks to Jacob and his super wonks, we will. I should confess that I love Jacob and have admired him from that moment when he started writing his PhD thesis outside my office. Actually, he was well along, so I felt unguilty about wasting his time on many policy and political discussions. And this panel is really the economics version of Don McLean's American Pie. You remember the line? The three men I admire most, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. That would be Henry Aaron, Bob Greenstein, and Gary Burtless. I will just very briefly introduce them. I want to say two other things before I turn it over to them. One is I am really hoping that some right-wing blog takes 2.5 minutes of Jacob's comments completely out of context by way of showing that the Bush years were the period of nirvana in economic security, thereby giving him lots of publicity and opportunity to present what he actually said today to a very broad audience. The other thing I want to say is that Jacob deserves a lot of credit for guts in this. Many of you, probably most of you, know Jacob's great book, The Great Risk Shift. And there was an enormous polemic around this whole issue of economic insecurity as he presented it. Some people would fold up, some people would get stubborn. Jacob just took this controversy and built it into something much bigger and more important, as we were agreeing that it goes back to what coaches say. He just worked through the pain and made it and made something very, very important here. And I am grateful that two of my Brookings colleagues, Henry Aaron and somebody I have so much admiration and respect for, he is one of the most important people in the city, Bob Greenstein, is on the panel. Henry is currently the Bruce and Virginia McClory Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at Brookings. He's a noted healthcare expert. He has focused much of his career on the reform of healthcare financing, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, tax and budget policy. Basically, he knows everything about everything. He's a graduate of UCLA and holds a PhD in economics from Harvard. Gary Burtless holds the John C. and Nancy D. Whitehead Chair in Economic Studies at Brookings. His research is on issues related also to public financing and aging, saving, labor markets, income distribution, social insurance, and the behavioral effects of government tax and transfer policies. He graduated from Yale and got his PhD in economics at MIT. Bob Greenstein is the founder and executive director of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He is an expert on the federal budget and a range of domestic policy issues, from anti-poverty programs to various aspects of tax policy. He has won so many awards that I can't list them. He writes everywhere. He has built the most extraordinary staff. He is a graduate of Harvard College, and I am proud to say he is an ardent Boston Red Sox fan. We will start with Henry Aaron, I guess in my trilogy, the father of the group.
I've got the right age.
My trinity, I should say.
As both Janice and Jacob pointed out, this is another in a lengthy list of economic indices. In a certain sense, we live by indices of various kinds. When we talk about people, we ask how old they are, how many years of school, what their socioeconomic status is. If we're talking about the economy, we want to know GDP, growth rates, poverty incidence. Now, the unifying characteristic of every one of those indices is that they're imperfect. They all leave out relevant information. Bill's 45, but he doesn't look a day over 35. Jane only graduated from high school, but she's a whiz with numbers. GDP is $40,000, but it doesn't count the degradation in the quality of the air. National income grew 20%, but it all accrued to a small group of the population. And so on with every index that you can think of. The Economic Security Index is another summary statistic. Like all the rest, it contains some information, but it doesn't contain all that one would like to know about economic security. So the relevant question to ask of it is it good enough? I believe there are a few questions that one should ask the authors of the index. First of all, does the index report on something one would really like to know? Second, does the index do as good a job as one can reasonably do with the available data? And third, more open-ended, what are the additional questions raised by the index that could be answered with better data? It's the way forward. Well, with respect to the first question, I suspect we would all agree that the answer is pretty clearly a resounding yes. This index does provide information about something that we care about. The question of whether more or fewer people are exposed to large economic declines strikes me as a genuinely important and interesting issue. As Jacob pointed out, providing a good answer isn't easy. Just what items should you add up to count as income? What items should be subtracted because they are non-discretionary calls on income? How do living arrangements, the existence of one- and two-earner families, enter into the definition of economic security? Is increasing debt a sign of a non-discretionary call on income, or an indication of access to credit that can help one bridge economic insecurity? On all of these questions, the hard issue is where do you get the data in order to fill things in? There are, regrettably, a whole host of analytical problems, some of which don't have clear answers, to which we would like to have answers. The second question, does the index do as good a job as possible with the available data, is the reason why I'm here. The folks at Rockefeller early on asked me to chair a group that would comment and criticize the work that Jacob and his colleagues were doing, and where we had ideas to actually make suggestions. Janice mentioned the roster. We met twice. We wrote repeated comments. The most important of which was made by somebody who isn't here today, and that was Hank Farber of Princeton. It was a very simple comment. He said, "Remember the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid." The idea was to keep the index transparent and easily understood, not to get into a lot of fancy econometric analysis built into the index, for which there might be a good intellectual case, but that would make the index opaque to lay readers. So the virtue of the characteristic of simplicity is both the virtue and the weakness of this index. You can quibble with it, and every analyst who looks at it will have questions. But the abiding virtue is that you can understand it. In the quibble category, I want to emphasize that the data are not everything that anyone would want. And I think one of the major contributions of the index, if it comes to be widely accepted, is going to be to encourage the collection of new and better data that will enable people to answer some questions that, as Jacob indicated, he wanted to but couldn't answer. There is a huge number of additional questions. In fact, as Jacob indicated by the forthcoming reports, I think he's created something approximating the Full Employment Act for himself and his colleagues, at least provided that Rockefeller or some other funder will undertake to support the effort. Let me conclude with a bit of a personal note. Jacob can testify. I started personally on this technical advisory committee with a huge amount of skepticism that the job could be done in an intellectually defensible way. My skepticism has been put to rest. That doesn't mean that the index is free of problems or that further work will not improve it. But that is equally true of statistics on gross domestic product or the balance of trade or unemployment. Warts and all, we could not make sensible economic policy without those statistics. We will have to see whether the public in the end accepts and uses this index. But I think it reflects a serious effort and deserves to be taken seriously in our discussions of the socioeconomic status and the insecurity that Americans face. Thanks very much. Bob, I think you're...
Well, let me build on what Henry was saying. Like Henry, at the outset, I had skepticism. In fact, I called Henry up and said, should I really serve on this advisory panel? Is it possible to do such an index? I ended up going on the panel because Henry talked me into the idea that it was worth a try. And like Henry and others on the panel, on the advisory committee, as the work went forward, increment by increment, draft by draft, set of email exchanges by email exchanges, our sense of this measure got stronger and stronger. It has changes in income. It folds in assets. It has, as you've heard, out-of-pocket medical costs. That's a pretty rich combination of data, yet it manages to do it in a way that's not only, as Henry said, simple, but is quite transparent. It's not mysterious what's going on in this index. Lots of other measures are much more mysterious. I think that sometimes inhibits their greater acceptance and use. I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but if you think of what, especially given the data limitations, this index is trying to capture, and the things that it blends. It doesn't look at income in the absence of assets. It doesn't put changes in out-of-pocket medical costs off to the side, and yet it comes up with this summary measure. So I find it almost, this is the word, almost elegant in the way that it puts this together and gives us this picture that we can look at over time. Henry noted quite rightly, there are some limitations in the data. people could raise questions here or quibbles there. If you think of the other major measures that have become widely accepted and talked about regularly in the news media and elsewhere, after years of use for almost every one of those, there actually are questions and quibbles one could have as well. I could mention the poverty measure as an example. Obviously, there are, it goes beyond quibbles, the issues one would have with the poverty measure. One of the things I think we should think about is the potential use of this measure in ways that go beyond just sort of a question of what's happening in this aspect of the economy, but also thinking of it in terms of broader political and cultural trends. I'm actually looking at EJ a little bit here. When one looks at, for example, the period we're in now, some of the increases, the volatility of political attitudes, the growing negativity, negative attitudes towards all sorts of institutions, public and private, one can simply say we have a bad economy. That's certainly at the core, but I think it's too simple to simply say the unemployment rate is 9.5%. I've now explained everything that's happening in political or cultural attitudes. When I look at the data in this measure of what's happened historically, and although we don't have the data yet, what is likely to have happened in the last couple of years when the data become available in terms of this index, I think they give one an important additional dimension to understand what's going on. So I sometimes look at things a little bit, having been a former American history graduate student, sometimes think about if one were 50 years from now trying to look at what's going on now and understand it, what would one look at? Well, if one were looking at prior periods of time and one had an index like this and could track the trends in economic security, I think it definitely would be something that not only economic historians, but people tracking political trends and cultural trends would very much want to look at. And if you, coming out of the training I had, have the view I do, that the sorts of things that a historian might want to look at 50 years from now, to the degree that you can have some of that information now, you do want to look at it now to try to contemporaneously understand current trends. I think that this index could be very useful in that respect. And now someone could respond and say, well, if you're thinking of it in those terms, isn't it almost an issue of psychology in terms of the economic security? How many times a day in business sections of the paper do we read the use of the term confidence in talking about investment markets? And if confidence is very important in investment markets and understanding what's going on there, it seems to me that analogously, economic security ought to be important in trying to understand what's going on with the general public and how it reacts to a variety of things. So in short, I think the index is a significant addition to measures that we have to look at various developments that are going on, not only in an economic context, but in broader contexts as well.
Thank you.
Jacob and his colleagues have created what I think is a new and very helpful indicator of one important dimension of family well-being. I'll leave it to others and those of you in this audience to discuss whether it will ultimately turn out to be useful. Let me take a couple of minutes to talk about some technical and scientific aspects of the index. First of all, I think Jacob and his colleagues have performed a signal service by putting a sound concept of economic insecurity on the table, and equally important, then developing a practical implementation of that idea so that people can trace out the trend in insecurity. Jacob's team has provided us with an index that can measure what we hope it will measure, namely trends in insecurity and income fluctuations that can either improve or reduce families' well-being. There is an important question on the scientific side. Are the available data sources good enough, and are they timely enough to make the new index helpful, either in thinking about developments in the economy or making policy prescriptions about what ought to change? I'm an optimist, but I still look forward to hearing what you and the audience say and what outside observers, scientists, and policymakers in particular have to say. Is the concept useful to you and to them? And is its implementation in this measure reliable? Now, my view is that the new index passes the test of usefulness and reliability. The data that Jacob and his team must use are not ideal, as you just heard. However, they're good enough to give us a sound indication of the trend in economic insecurity. The definition that the team adopted and its actual implementation in this index is partly determined by the data. Let there be no doubt about it. That is one of the limitations that helped structure the very definition that they came up with. Problems with the data will affect the basic level of insecurity that is measured in the index in a given year. Perhaps that level will be a bit too high, perhaps it'll be way too low. What we hope is that the data limitations affect the level of this new measure, but do not affect its trend, because it's the trend that should matter for thinking about developments in the economy and in family well-being. We want the index to give us a reliable indicator of the direction of this aspect of families' well-being. We want a reliable gauge that will also tell us whether insecurity is greater in some groups in the population than it is in others. After working as an outside advisor to this team for the past couple of years, I think the new index passes these tests. Do not suffer under the illusion that the unemployment rate or the poverty rate or the CPI do not face the same kinds of problems as this index does. They all face very similar problems, if not identical ones. They do have the advantage that there's an immense government apparatus to constantly measure these concepts and keep them up to date, and there is a huge outside source of information and a source of information within the government, a lot of expertise to help guide this development. This has been done on a small scale with very, very bright people, but it doesn't have the backing of an immense government apparatus to collect ideal data. But even though you may think you understand the concepts behind the CPI or the poverty rate or the unemployment rate, I doubt whether more than a couple of people in this room can accurately describe, for example, the precise way that the BLS distinguishes the unemployed from the employed on the one hand, or Americans who say they're out of the workforce. Very few people know that, but they still use the unemployment rate, notwithstanding their lack of comprehension and their lack of knowledge of the detailed scientific controversy that has surrounded the development of the unemployment concept. The precise definitions of the poor and the non-poor under our official definition, as Bob just said, may be terrible, and you may disagree about where the line is drawn. What we have to hope is that the misclassification under our own personal view of what constitutes poverty affects the level but does not affect the trend. Because what we most care about is poverty getting better? Is it getting worse? Who suffers more and who suffers less? In other words, while we may disagree about who is poor and who is non-poor, who is out of the labor force and who is in and actively seeking a job,
What we hope is that the government's definition of poverty, of the unemployed, doesn't obscure the direction in these indexes, that we still can see what the trend is and whether things are much worse or much better than they were at some previous time, and whether they're much worse or much better for some groups in the population. Similarly, we have to hope that this new index of economic security, actually of insecurity when you think about it, produces the right estimate of the trend in insecurity over time. Now, let me conclude by making an observation. One reason for my general confidence is that the basic trends uncovered in the report are consistent with those of most other major analysis of this issue. 30 years ago, virtually no one cared about it. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a good set of researchers started seeing whether instability in earnings may be a partial explanation for the rise in inequality of earnings in the United States. And they found something that was surprising. There was rising instability in wages in the United States. This early research had an effect on what labor economists, first of all, and what other social scientists later on looked into. The instability was part, not a big part, but part of the explanation for rising inequality. Other researchers followed up on this early research, and most of them confirmed the original result, partly spurred by this research. Other analysts, including Jacob, looked into the implications for family income instability. And they mostly found the report that is the result that's reported here. Income instability has risen since the 1970s. This became an important topic of investigation in and of itself. The rise in family income instability, however, occurred against a very surprising backdrop. Since the mid-1980s, between the mid-1980s and 2007, there was a reduction in the instability of the overall economy. So we had a paradox in which the overall economy was growing more smoothly. The recessions were less severe. The year-to-year and quarter-to-quarter moves in GDP were smaller in proportional terms. And yet, on the flip side, when we put the microscope over families, we saw that the instability of their own economic circumstances was rising. And I think this is a very fascinating topic for research. So for 22 years, we have a mystery. The instability of the overall economy declined, but the instability of workers' earnings and of households' income has been rising. The Great Recession has brought an end to this paradox. We now have simultaneously a huge rise, I think, in the instability of household incomes and of the overall economy. This is a very severe recession. That, I think, is a little bit of the intellectual background of this project. I, for one, think that they have conducted this project in a remarkably honest intellectual fashion. They have been responsive to the suggestions and to the criticisms of the panel. And I've been very honored to serve on the panel because the other members are people that I've always looked up to. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you. This is like a revival. Previously skeptical economists come forward and say, I believe. So this is Jacob, the sainted Jacob Hacker should feel good about that. I basically would like to put 4 broad questions on the table, which everybody doesn't have to answer all of them, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. The first, of course, is to just ask Jacob if there's anything he wants to respond to. The second, and Gary alluded to this, what are the chances of this index, or one that builds on this index, getting adopted formally by the federal government? Because I do think it would change the nature of our discussion of these questions if this became a regularly reported number. The third, and this builds on Bob's point, what policy, cultural, political, or dare I say it, moral issues might get more attention if this index became a popular measure. And then lastly, and Gary started on this, it is very striking that from the moment the index starts, the trends are down. I mean, with interruptions a little bit from economic good times, but your sort of clear line there, Jacob, suggested a steady trend toward greater insecurity. I'd love the learned members of this panel to suggest some reasons for that. So, Jacob, why don't you start, and then any of you can take on any of the other questions. Jacob, of course, can take them all on if he wants. In 15 minutes, it will feel like 5 minutes.
Well, I'd like to keep it very brief because I really want to hear the audience. And so I'll just say, first of all, that I'm very pleased that I have moved the Technical Advisory Committee from extremely skeptical to their normal skeptical stance, and which is quite an achievement in itself. And I will just mention a couple quick things. One is that I didn't mention before. One aspect of the index that may seem the most, in some ways, contestable, arbitrary, is this choice of 25% losses, including medical costs. And it turns out that this fits pretty well with what our survey found Americans think is a kind of level of economic loss that will cause hardship. When people are asked how long their household could go without their current income before they would experience hardship, the median response was essentially around 3 months. So for a typical family, typical household, they said that they could go somewhere between 2 months and 4 months. And I think that's was surprising to us in the sense that we were moving toward that definition even before we had really looked at these results. But it's a reminder that that I want to just get across is that our real thinking throughout this process was to try to come up with an index, as Janice suggested, that reflected a sense of what really matters to families when it comes to economic security, but was based not on people's perceptions, but on the underlying circumstances of their lives, which is not to say that their perceptions are not independently very important and interesting to study. The only other thing I would like to say, because we have a lot of distinguished researchers in the audience, I believe, based on the RSVP list, is that I would say that a lot of the work that's been done on explaining why household income instability has gone up has been done by Karen Dinan of the Brookings Institution, whom I hope is here, and her work has really helped us understand that this is both about what seems most obvious with the trends, that unemployment and job loss clearly is a big part of the story, but also that we've seen more instability of earnings even for people who are more or less continuously employed, which is really the side of it that I think is worth investigating. Is this because, for example, more people are changing jobs, transiting from one part of the economy to another where their skills are displaced and where they may be earning much less? I would also say that that's really our central and most difficult area of investigation. And it really brings us back to Gary's point about levels versus trends. We are going to look at really, as much as we can, and it's difficult with these data for all the reasons that have been discussed, at what are the underlying causes, or at least the correlates of these large income declines. We've designed the index in a way that I think really focuses on these involuntary losses that people fear so much, but we're going to really look at that. But one of the things that I want to emphasize is that even if some portion of these losses are voluntary, people leaving the labor force, even though they don't have that safety net to hold them up, unless there's been a big change in the mix of these voluntary and involuntary causes, the trend over time will remain as we find. And it could even be more sharp because it's possible that it's shifted in the other direction as well. And I will leave it there and just say I'm really honored to have these, what are for this group, stunningly positive comments. So thank you.
Anybody want to take on any of the others I put down on the table?
No, I'll pass. Well, I was thinking about your question of what would it take for the government to sort of pick this up. So one would probably need a combination of some key federal statistical and economic agencies interested, and they would need some resources. I mean, I think it's unlikely. Look, for example, at the mid-'90s National Academy of Sciences recommendations on changing poverty.
the Census Bureau, the Commerce Department, is now moving to set up an alternative poverty measure with some of those concepts. But it isn't as though it's saying there's nothing for us to do. We'll simply take the they're doing significant new research themselves based on those precepts.
Yeah.
But before developing the specifics of the measure and the data enumeration that will go into it and the like. The point that I'm making is that while in the scope of the federal budget the dollars will be tiny, there will be some resource needs for the federal government to move forward on this. And the challenge there is we're entering into a period where there's going to be significant squeezing of resources for domestic discretionary programs, particularly including agency operating budgets. And so that may have a bit of an inhibiting factor. So I think the conclusion that I draw from that is that probably some major players, the National Economic Council in the White House, chairs of an important committee or two, would need to get interested in this and conclude that at a minimum that they wanted some key federal agencies to look into this and to do some work leading to the question of does this make sense to formalize and adopt as a government measure, and if so, to find within budget some, I think would be quite small but not zero, amount of resources to move forward with that.
Thank you. I knew you'd offer a very practical roadmap. That's a great idea. Gary, do you want to get on any of those, including...
I will give your fourth question a try. Why has instability increased? James Carville, as always, offers the simplest, although the least satisfactory answer to this question. It's the economy, stupid. From what my guess would be that it is a set of things in the labor market and perhaps also in family structure and shifts in family structure that may be generating these results. The answer to this question will only be known when there's a lot more research devoted to it. But there are some hints in the data. Job tenure in the United States has shrunk, except for people engaged in career employment over the last 25 or 30 years. So men reach age 45, they reach age 55, and there are fewer of them that have very long job tenures with their current employer. That means that there are more separations that are occurring over the course of the work life, and those would generate changes in income, because for most working age households, wages are the main source of their income. I think the question, well, why did that happen? Well, maybe it's because there is a new implicit contract between workers and their employers. Employers have less loyalty, and that is reciprocated on the part of employees. It could also be that more people have wages that depend on performance, either their own performance or the firm's current performance, and that too would generate more ups and downs in people's earned incomes. And there could also be changes in the implications of family structure and family instability on the measured income that Jacob and his team came up with. I don't know. I think a lot of the conjectures I just offered are ones that are subject to very rigorous analysis, and we can determine whether or not they're true. But it is the case that these other aspects of at least work life in the United States have shown a rise in instability.
I just wanted to carry on Bob Greenstein's comment. I think one of the necessary conditions for this index to become officially institutionalized would be, and this does speak to the additional resources that would be needed, it would be necessary, I think, to develop, in effect, a tailored survey that would provide the data needed to do this. It's difficult, I think, unless you saw the sausage being made, to appreciate how constraining and how many obstacles were created by the inadequacies of the available data sources. If this is to become part of the economic, intellectual furniture of the nation, it's going to require a special survey, and I have to say that the kind of survey I think you would need to do this index would be a fantastic boon, because it would have to be a panel survey sufficiently thick to provide detailed information and sustained over time. The panels might change periodically rather than like the PSID, but they'd have to be reasonably sustained, and it would permit a wide range of analysis that currently is. It would require a richness of data on healthcare spending, assets, and income, and it would, I think, permit a richness of data, of research that data inadequacies have precluded heretofore.
Thank you.
Well, I found the comment Henry just made exciting and sobering at the same time.
Exactly.
Sobering in the sense that for those of us who in recent years have been involved from time to time in efforts to try to convince appropriations committees not to drastically cut back or eliminate various census surveys that we already have, and that's before we've entered an atmosphere with squeezes on domestic discretionary appropriations like we're heading into. Adding a major new survey, exciting as it would sound, as Henry just described
absolutely.
it, is going to be difficult. Two other thoughts. If you think of how could an index of this sort, if we had it, and we had the kind of survey Henry talked about, and we had it on an ongoing basis, how could it inform various policy debates? Well, two examples. Obviously, as everyone in this room knows, the debate over health reform isn't over, and there's going to be a whole new round of the debate when it takes effect, and it begins to play out in the real world. Now, it would be interesting to have the data to know what the effect of the changes in health reform are on economic insecurity. If health reform works as hoped, it ought to have some reduction by being able to significantly reduce the circumstances in which people entirely lose insurance or are cut off when their medical bills go way up and have much higher out-of-pocket costs. Separately, there are two related, although they may be distinct or they may be combined, policy debates coming, one relating to Social Security and another related to pension reform. Obviously, economic insecurity is at the core of what one thinks about when one thinks about pensions and Social Security. So, on the one hand, it's going to be difficult to get the resources for a new survey. On the other hand, we're entering into some really tough, very difficult policy debates going forward with some wrenching decisions that have to be made. And it would be nice to be able to have more data to help inform the difficult decisions.
Thank you very much. I just want to say, it seems to me if populism is supposed to be fashionable right now, there's an enormous populist case for this data because it's truer to the actual circumstance of lots and lots of families, the vast majority of families in the country. So there are packs for everything. How about populists for good data on working families,
Wow.
It's not a good acronym, though. We got to work on the acronym. I love New America. I've never seen this before. They paste a standard set of instructions for moderators. The first one says, I want to turn to the audience, remind questioners to 1, wait for the microphone, 2, identify themselves, and 3, keep their questions concise. And then there's coaching advice to me. It says, be a firm moderator. Don't be shy about urging a questioner presenter to get to their point or get back on topic. So that's from them right here. Who wants to, right in front there on the left, my colleague, if I recognize you in the light. Yes, how are you?
I'll do my best, EJ. So Karen Dyden from the Brookings Institution. So first of all, I want to start out with some praise. Jacob and your team, you've done a really impressive job on a very important question. Then just getting to my question, I want to voice my support for something you just touched on, Jacob, which is further effort to tease out what portion of the rise in your index could be due to greater choice and therefore not necessarily a bad thing. You mentioned the possibility that greater flexibility in the workplace has allowed families to choose to vary their work arrangements in ways that would cause their income to be more volatile, but not necessarily a bad thing. I just say in my own work, we've found that it looks like the increased income variance has to do more with the earnings per hour as opposed to hours worked, suggesting it's not a voluntary choice. But I think relatedly, on this question of choice, is the question of whether you are picking up people as insecure who have suffered kind of a modest decline in income, and as time has gone on and we've seen financial innovation, people have been able to borrow to get through those tough times, borrow temporarily. So I think that makes them more likely to be classified as insecure because you get the modest income decline and then you get an increase in their debt service associated with that borrowing, but it's not necessarily, again, a bad thing. So I guess the most straightforward question is whether there is anything in your index that tries to control for this, and I'm not actually advocating that because I actually agree with the panelists that the transparency is a real virtue of this index, and also just whether you have plans to think about these things.
Thank you so much, and thank you really for your work on this because I think it's I butchered the findings of your work because that was exactly what I was referring to, this recent finding, and we have a quote from you in there that it doesn't look as if a lot of this is due to voluntary shifts, in particular in terms of understanding the trend over time. I mean, I think the question you ask, and I've admired the other papers you've written that have looked at this question of whether or not borrowing is a sort of new safety net, whether greater innovation in credit markets can provide people with the means to weather economic shocks better than in the past. And as I read your work, I think the argument would be that financial innovation, you're not quite with Volcker in saying that the last great financial innovation was the ATM, but you do argue that there's a temporal break, that in early developments in financial markets that made credit more easy to access probably did help families, but that things kind of got out of control, which seems pretty obvious at this point. And that's what's really hard to measure in this bounded period. And I think in some of our subsequent analyses where we look at people over longer periods of time, we'll be able to look a little bit more at the extent to which borrowing during downturns puts you at subsequent economic risk or even causes losses in themselves. Think about borrowing for a home the value of which falls. By not bringing in housing, wealth, or debt, we open ourselves up to an obvious critique that people can borrow against the value of our home. Of course, we also vastly understate the degree of insecurity in the recent period. But I think that in some ways we do get, by doing that, we're closer to looking at the side of the financial market that you're talking about. And there are some writings on this, including James Sullivan's work on unsecured debt as a safety net, that so far have suggested that perhaps not as surprisingly that I think it's very different across the economic spectrum, the extent to which people are capable of borrowing during periods of economic loss. And so what we might find is there is a class effect here. You find it in Karen and her co-author, Douglas Elmendorf, whom you may know of, find that it matters. It's different. The consumption effects, the spending effects of having an income loss seem to be different depending on sort of proximity to the bottom of the economic ladder, suggesting that perhaps there are means that we're not counting here for higher income people to buffer income losses, but that it makes those at the bottom of the ladder or bottom middle of the ladder look even worse off because those means don't seem to be available. All of that, I think, is worth exploring in supplemental analyses. I would stick with as you suggested, with the simplest possible index, and just say that and think about whether these additional analyses would alter our view of the trend as opposed to the level. But I would say that the inability of us to look at wealth changes in a reliable way is not just a problem with our analysis, it's really a problem with the available evidence. And as good as the Survey of Consumer Finance is the gold standard, if you will, the one that really gets at what people have in terms of wealth, especially at the top, it's just not possible to use those existing data to look at change over time. And given what's happened in our credit markets, it seems like a huge gap in our present knowledge. So I would say that if there's any area that sort of fits within this general theme of the need for new and better data, it would be wealth dynamics.
The gentleman back there, right near you, since you've got the mic there. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Bill O'Hare with the Kids Count Project at the Annie Casey Foundation. I'm curious about how this index matches up with data which I assume is available about subjective feelings of economic insecurity over time or across groups. And I guess there's three parallel questions. One, if they don't match up, how do you explain that? Or if they do match up, why not just use that polling data instead of this index to convey trends and patterns of economic insecurity?
I would like to ask public opinionator to speak on that. Mark, do you mind?
So it's a good question. We, as Jacob mentioned, did several surveys that have both a panel component and several cross-sectional cuts on this question. And it turns out to be complex in ways which would take a week to begin to explain. Let me try to just capture the essence of this. It is certainly the case, as Jacob described, that income losses of the sort we measure here and the buffering effects associated with wealth and the additional shocks associated with non-discretionary expenditures all are powerful predictors of people's subjective perceptions of insecurity. That being said, you add those all up as sources of people's shocks, because we measured people's experiences as well as their attitudes about insecurity, that accounts for only about half the variation in subjective economic insecurity. So there are a lot of people out there who do not get counted as insecure in this index because they had a family member or a friend that experienced that kind of shocks, and now they're scared it might happen to them because they had a shock several years ago, and the residue of that anxiety or the financial consequences of having spent down their wealth buffers or their ability to borrow from family members have been depleted. So what we are capturing is an important nugget with these objective measures, but it is not the full range, scope, or prevalence of the extent of insecurity that people are experiencing and reporting on these surveys. I think it's a powerful indicator, but if anything, a tip of the iceberg indicator of something that's a much deeper and broader phenomenon in American life.
The lady over here. I'll move to the back. If wave your hand because it's hard to see in the lights. Thank you.
I'm Mitzi Worth. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School. I find this a very interesting beginning, and I'm always looking. The number one question I have is compared to what? And I think that's what this is about, compared to what? The thing that struck me was I'm really interested in understanding the compared to what stories about how they handle medical care in the other developed countries. And I don't think it's a story that's been well told here. I also think the medical bill that's been passed is unbelievably, you can't understand it. I mean, I consider myself reasonably bright. I haven't a clue as to what it's going to be about. So there's clearly a lot of anxiety about it. But I think you have to have these compared to what stories so you can make people understand better where they are rather than just in isolation. I think the other thing that struck me was we've had an attitude in this country about spend, spend, spend. It's kind of like drill, baby, drill. And it gets complicated because if they're not spending, the economy doesn't go up. So I don't know quite how we deal with all of these things. But clearly people have been overspending and not saving.
One of the economists want to have a response to that?
Well, just very briefly, I think that compared to other countries, it's almost certain, one has to always hedge comments like this, but it's almost certain that the contribution of variability in out-of-pocket in MOOP is going to be much larger in this country than it would be in other developed industrial nations. It's a little bit tricky. Jason Furman, before he went into the administration, did a paper for the Hamilton Project at Brookings in which he compared out of the proportion of healthcare spending nationally that was paid directly by individuals. And the statistic for the United States was surprisingly low compared to many other countries. Exactly why that's the case, he didn't go into in detail. The fact is we think of the high cost of health insurance in the United States, but the large majority of the population has third-party insurance one way or another that covers a great deal of healthcare spending. And other countries have national coverage, but they may have significant cost sharing in one form or another. So I suspect that your instinct and mine, I'm imputing to you, that out-of-pocket healthcare spending would be more significant source of instability in the United States than elsewhere is correct, but it's not something you can just assume without actually doing the analysis. So that's another job for you, Jacob.
Is that just as a percentage, or is it as actual dollars out of pocket?
It was as a percentage of total health care.
Because
spending.
then our costs are so much higher that you could still have more dollars out of pocket without, but a smaller percentage. Is that?
But the
fair?
remarkable aspect of Furman's statistics was how low the fraction was in the United States.
Thank you.
Can I comment on the compared with what question? It's germane in another way besides comparing the United States with other countries. It's germane in thinking, well, could it be that the beginning of our statistics about income instability happened to come from a period in which there was an unusual amount of stability in American household income? We know that sometimes the way we think of a problem is determined by how long the easily accessible data sets have lasted. So when I was a youth going to college, the United States economists were flagging themselves about how terrible productivity growth was in the United States. And they were thinking of this comparison of how fast the Russians' productivity was rising. And when we put ourselves in that frame, we looked terrible. But then when researchers did analysis going back much, much further than the immediate post-war period or even the beginning of the Great Depression, it turned out actually when we were flagging ourselves for the terrible performance, we were living in the golden age of American productivity improvement. And it really, our vision of what we were doing was framed by how long the data were. It could very well be that this period that the panel study of income dynamics first permitted us to analyze from 1969 to 1982 or 83 was just a period of unusually placid income change in American households. And so we could be comparing ourselves right now with the golden age of stability in American household finances.
Jacob, do you have any plans to sort of take this index transnational, international? Because I do think it would be fascinating to see how this would apply to other countries.
I do indeed, and I would like Philip, the detonator, to just say 2 or 3 words about our ongoing work on that.
That wasn't a setup. I was actually curious.
So we started looking into this, and if you think comparing income over time in the U.S. is a difficult task, which is a difficult task, which cost us years of work, mainly Rob's work, then comparing income across countries over time is just really difficult. So there is very severe data constraints that we're facing also just in terms of access to data and availability of data, because the U.S. turns out to be a country where panel data are not only like relatively abundant, but also easily accessible in comparison. But we started looking at this, and I think I want to echo here that what we're going to do is we're going to concentrate on trends, not so much on levels, just because it's not so clear how good we are at comparing things. And one of the things we ran into is like, can we replicate this indicator in other countries? And we won't be able to do that for all components. For example, wealth is not regularly asked about in other surveys. And MOPE doesn't make much sense in many European countries. I mean, there just aren't any medical out-of-pocket expenditures that you have to bill yourself because you have a health insurance that covers you for this. So we're going to have a limited version of the index that we can compare across countries and over time. And as far as we can say, the US is exceptional. And it's one of the few countries, as far as you can see at this point, where it actually goes up over time. And I think in the UK, for example, it's trending downwards and so on and so forth. But that has to wait, and that's a long project that we're working on.
Jacob, was this panel supposed to end at 11:30, by the way? Is that what we announced it for? I know Bob has to go. I thought, or can we run it to 12, let Bob say a few words before he leaves? What's the...
I think the constraint is the patience of our audience on the one hand, and the availability of the facilities on the other hand.
So should we just run it? We'll run it 10 more minutes, but we'll let Bob. That's great. Yeah, we were running it under Senate rules if it were announced to end at 11:30. Bob, do you want to say something before you have to go?
But if it was Senate rules, one of us could actually stop this entire panel.
Do you have? Okay, thank you. Yes, that's true. Who has back there? There's a hand on the right that I see.
Hi, my name is Eric, and I'm a college student. So this gives me. I'm taking this home as far as being a young adult, and want to know. First of all, I noticed on page 5 it talks about how it doesn't include retired people in terms of loss of income, which makes sense. But I want to know how it does treat young adults, independents who then form their own households. So that's my question.
Well, thanks. And you're allowing me to flag two features of the findings that or one feature of the findings and one feature of our analysis that I hadn't mentioned. We do exclude those who are entering retirement, those who have moved from the workforce into retired status, for the obvious reason that that's a period in which income declines are expected, and there's debate over what the appropriate replacement rate is in retirement, but many models suggest that for middle-income people, you might see a 30% or thereabouts decline in your income, and still, given your lesser expenses, your ability to cook more rather than eat out and so on, that you might actually, your well-being may not be affected. So, but once you're retired, you're in the index, and you can see that people who are older do experience large income shocks. And that, but that is much less frequent. And for older Americans, it's far more the medical expenditure side of the picture that leads to insecurity, despite the universality of Medicare. We not only have evidence that across countries there is medical out-of-pocket spending, even with universal insurance. We have quite a lot of evidence from within the United States that older people, despite Medicare, do still have often very high out-of-pocket medical costs. The thing that is very distinctive about young Americans is that not only that the medical out-of-pocket expenditure side of it is not a big part of the explanation, but that they have much higher levels of economic instability. And there's been a fair amount of research on this question, and I think it fits very closely with Gary's notion that there may have been changes in the labor force, and in part what we're witnessing, right, is the cohort of Americans who are experiencing from the very beginning this new labor force. I was struck, and this is not reflected so much in the index, but I was struck by a statistic that I recently saw that even before the current downturn, about 40% of younger Americans were entering the labor force without health insurance. And that struck me, as well as a lot of the recent findings that suggest that debt levels are higher than they used to be because of college and other educational costs. And so I think when young adults are forming households, well, first of all, young adults are now more likely than they used to be part of another household, the one they started out in. I realized that this may be a European model we're adopting, not necessarily the one we want to adopt, but because in some Southern European countries, moving in with your parents back in with your parents is very common. But that's one behavioral response we've seen. Another thing we've seen, of course, is delays in some of the sort of normal middle class, what we used to take as sort of granted as the middle class steps, buying a home, getting married, and so on. And in terms of our index, we don't treat young adults any differently. When they form households, just like everyone else, what we do is we follow individuals. So when their life circumstances change, we pick that up. And so families, as Gary said, this is driven both by changes in people's family circumstances and changes in their and their family's earnings. But we're going to figure out whether or not there's a distinctive set of causes for younger adults than there is for older adults when we do these more causal analyses.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, I just read across a study by a social conservative showing that, or at least claiming to show that the student loan program, student debt, is actually postponing family formation among young people. And I was very pleased to see a social conservative link economic data to their values. And it's something I think we need to think about more. Away in the back, because I don't want to be discriminating against those on the front of the more secure people on the front of the room.
Thanks, EJ. Larry Michelle from EPI. I'm also a member of the review panel. And
yes, Larry, I'm so sorry that I did not mention you earlier because I was scribbling out names as we started. So
mine is hard to spell. I rise in praise of the index and the team and the work that Henry did in shepherding us and the work that you and your team did. I just want to make a comment, not a question, which is basically two things. One, we shouldn't be surprised at these results because, in my view, economic policy for the last 3 decades has basically denigrated the whole notion of a good job and economic security, and this would seem to be the logical outcome of the shift in policy we saw in the late 70s, early 80s. I would note that we've been estimating what the wealth holding of people is in recent months, and would find now that 40% of black households have zero or negative wealth, 30% of white households. So if anything, the insecurity of the American workforce is really escalated, perhaps even more than this index shows.
I think with this, I can make Larry's the last question. Does anybody want to make a summary comment of any kind or and to respond to Larry?
I just want to thank everyone and say that you should take a look at the website and certainly feel free to get in touch with us if you have suggestions for it or for anything else.
And I came up with my acronym for the organization that'll push this index. It's Help Economic Research on Economic Security, which works out to heroes, which the people who put this together, index together, really are. Thank you very much.